Hello, Mr. Ferrante here, and I'm going to summarize all of day 3 in one shot. So the first thing I want to say is that there are two ways to get JavaFX events in your program. One is you can bind events to your controls themselves. For example, here's my little demo program. So I can bind an event to the actual button itself. I can bind an event to the slider itself. And then secondly, you can pick a property of that control and bind to a property. So for example, with buttons, go to the button API. Buttons have all kinds of properties. For example, the location is stored as a X and Y property. And if the button moves around, instantly you could call some sort of function. Or buttons have a text property that keeps track of the text on the button. And if the text ever changes, it can cause an event to fire automatically. With sliders, as you click and drag around the slider, right, sliders keep track of their current value as an attribute. And if that attribute ever changes, you can cause an event to happen. So let's start with the first technique, which is binding events directly to the elements. And so to do this in your code, you're going to just pick your element that you want. In my case, it's going to be the OK button. So it's right here. And I'm going to say OK button dot set on. This works for all the controls. Just pick your control name, then type in set on, and look in the API for all the different set on methods. And you can see there are a lot of methods, and they're all which kind of event do you want to trigger or do you want to take care of. Let's do on mouse clicked for that button. So you have to pass in as a parameter whatever this says. Here, let's go to the API. Here's the API for this method. So it requires a parameter that's of type event handler, and the event handler has to take in mouse events. So it handles mouse events. Click on the event handler link, and it tells you that an event handler is just an interface. So we need to implement the event handler interface and make sure that in our particular case, the event handler is going to handle mouse events. So here it goes. I'm going to make my own custom class of this type. So in my code, I'll scroll down here, and in the same place that I would type a method, I'm going to make a class. So private class, I'll call it my button handler, and it's going to implement event handler, and then the event handler takes in mouse events. Or that's the kind of event it is. So import always JavaFX, and then since it's an interface, add the required method, and there is the method. So overrides the handle method. Okay, done. So I have a custom class that is the right kind of event handler that the button needed. So back up to my button. Now that I have the right kind of object, which is an event handler that handles mouse events, I can go ahead and just make one of these custom objects. So before this, I'm going to go ahead and just make my own. I'll call it Bob. So there's my own custom button handler named Bob, and Bob's going to be handling all the clicks. So now if my button gets clicked, it's going to call Bob the listener, and the listener is going to automatically call this method here, the handle method, when the action is fired. So we're just going to print out yellow for now. All right, here it goes. If I run the program, you can see that when I click on the button, it's printing out my custom message. Great. Now, if you have more than one button, here's how you can distinguish between them. Let's say, in addition to the OK button, Bob the handler is going to also handle the cancel button. So I'm going to go ahead down here and say, all right, cancel button. Same pattern as the other one, dot set on mouse clicked, and Bob the handler can also handle that button too. But now the problem is, how do you tell which button it was that was clicked on? And the answer to that is event has everything you need. Just type event and look at the list of things you can do. One of those things is you can grab the source. So getSource returns which object caused this to happen. So you can do an if statement and say, if the source of this is the OK button, because it literally returns the object that called it. So if it's the OK button, then you do one thing. Otherwise, if it's the cancel button, you can do that instead. So there's yellow and Nello. All right, now you notice that these two variables are not known because they're currently local variables inside of this particular method. I need to move them to be attributes of my entire class. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do. Okay, done. You can see here that I've now made these attributes, and now they're accessible by any methods or classes within this class. And so now down here, this private inner class can access these particular attributes. So now if I run my program, you can see that it's distinguishing whether or not I press the OK button versus the cancel button. So there's yellow and there's Nello, all done through getSource. So from this point, you can go ahead and just play around because you can pick any control. And an example is, let's say I choose my slider, right? You can attach any kind of listener to your slider. So here's my slider down here, and I'm going to go ahead and say slider.setOn, and just look in the list and say, all right, what kind of event do I want to happen? Do I want to track? So dragging, pressing, clicking, key presses, etc., etc. So all these are your options. Let's choose mouse entered. And again, pay attention to what it wants. It needs a custom event handler that handles mouse events. So you have to go ahead and make one of these, make it as a private inner class for now. So event handler that handles mouse events. So here it goes, down here. Private class, I'll call it slider handler implements, and then I already forgot. So, okay, once event handler of type mouse event, or that handles mouse events. So event handler, mouse event. Oh, you know what? Never mind. We already have that kind. We already have, this listener can do it. So take it back. We already have one. So I'm just going to use, was it Bob? Yeah, Bob is already our listener that does that. So we'll let Bob handle this stuff. And now if the mouse even enters the space of the slider, this function runs and I can just do whatever the heck I want. So I'm just going to go ahead and print out anything there, just to show you that it works. So here it is running. And of course, if I press a button here, it prints out this because it's not even inside of if statement. Like any event here is going to cause this to happen. So both buttons do that. But even the slider, if I enter the slider or exited, I did. Yeah. So now you can see that if my mouse enters this slider's region, which is probably right around here, then you'll see that it's going to print something because it's entering the slider. So here it is, my mouse. And as soon as I enter the slider's region, its bounding box, it prints out another one of these things. So that's how to attach listeners directly to your controls. It's 2 steps. Step number 1, you say set on, just that by itself. And then look in the API for all the set on methods. You choose one that you want, and then pay attention to the type. And then based on the type, you have to go ahead and make a custom class that implements this interface that handles whatever kind. Usually mouse events for all the mouse things. And so this can handle all the different mouse event kinds of things. There's some other ones that aren't mouse event. So for example, they're set on. And if I did these are almost all mouse event here, drag event, right? So I wanted to do set on drag dropped. I would need a event handler that handles drag events instead of mouse event. So you would just change out mouse event for drag event, go look at the API, and it's going to be the exact same kind of code, but drag event right here. So that's how to attach listeners to your controls directly. Now here's the problem. The problem is for our slider, for example, you don't care if the user's dragging around the slider because the user could drag from top to bottom here, and that's not really what you care about. You care about if the value of the slider changes. That's what you care about. So instead of attaching listeners to the slider itself, the slider has an attribute that keeps track of the current value. And if that value changes, you want to take action. So this is a new thing in JavaFX for you. So over here on the first slide, it talks about properties in JavaFX. A property is like a self-aware number that if its value changes, then it can cause a function to run. So primitives are just numbers like x equals 5. It's just a number, doesn't do anything. Then we talked about wrapper classes earlier this year. Wrapper classes are the object version of primitives. So an integer object also can track the value of 5, but it also can run functions. Then beyond this, the next thing we're saying is that there's something called properties in JavaFX, and well, a property. And a property would be like this, integer property. And then x equals new integer property, and then maybe 5. So an integer property is a data type for JavaFX, and it's basically a self-aware value that if the value changes, you can cause a function to run and handle the change. So they're super cool, and all the different controls that you have keep track of properties. So here's an example. Go to the slider API. That is right here. If you scroll down, you can see that this slider keeps track of lots of different attributes or properties of the slider. And there's all of these ones right here in the slider class, and it inherits all these ones. So there's tons of things you can track. Now the thing I care about is like, do you want to run a function when the maximum value of the slider changes? So if the slider goes from 0 to 100, and if your code changes this maximum value to be 200, because that could happen, then you could take some sort of action. If you want to track when the minimum value changes, then you could attach a listener to this value property. If the slider changes orientation from vertical to horizontal, then you could also take some sort of action. In this case, I want to track the value of the slider. So since this is the attribute name, there's always getter functions that are the same thing, but then tack on property. So because there's an attribute called value, I know there's a method called value property that returns this particular attribute. So off to my code. Okay, so for my slider, I'm going to go ahead and use the getter method. So slider dot value property. So I guarantee you every time if you find an attribute called whatever, there's definitely a getter method that's called that attribute property. And this returns the actual property of the attribute. Then once you have the attribute, you can add a listener to it. And it's going to be the same method every time, which is add listener. Then pay attention to the kind of listener it needs. So this needs a custom change listener that listens to number types. So we need to make our own custom change listener that listens to numbers. So here goes. Private class my change listener, and implements this change listener and then listens to numbers. And again, I'm not memorizing this. It's just in the API, if you go to add listener for this kind of property, then it will tell you in the API it needs a change listener right here, a change listener that listens to numbers. So that's how I knew to implement change listener, the number, it matches what's required by the API. All let's import JavaFX always, add the required method, done. And here's what you get in the parameters, by the way. So instead of an event, you get the actual property, in this case, the value property. And in terms of a number, you get its old value, what it used to be, and the new value, what it's now. And so the change method runs whenever you change the value of something, and it tells you its old new values. All right, for now, let's just print out the slider's current value. So we'll print out slider dot, and then, all right, my slider's not an attribute, so let me change that real quick. Okay, done. My slider now is an attribute of my class, and therefore now it's accessible down here. So now slider dot get value. So this is just me. When this function runs, I'm just going to print out to the console window the slider's current value. That's it. So let's go ahead and make an object of this type and use it as our slider change listener. All right, so right here, we'll call it Joe. So I have my own custom change listener. That's the right type of object that this thing needs. So Joe is our listener. Done. So here's what we're doing. We're asking the slider to give us back this instance variable, this attribute, right? It keeps track of its own value as, instead of a double or an integer, as a value property, or as a double property. And then, or is it actually, let's go find out. So the value property, let's find out what it returns. Yeah, it does return, it's a double, but instead of being a primitive double or a wrapper class double, it's the JavaFX version, which is a double property, because double properties are special kinds of data that can listen for events. So it's basically a double, but it's self-aware. All right, let's run this and see what we get. So here you go. Now as I drag the slider around, you can see that it's printing out here. And so remember, I never said in my code, am I dragging the slider? I didn't say that. What I said was, look, if the value property ever changes, then have Joe tell us. So what's really happening is, in fact, I don't even need the mouse. Watch this. If I press my keyboard left and right, even though my mouse isn't touching it, the value of the slider is still changing, and therefore it's causing changes over here, because when the value property changes, Joe, our listener, it runs this method and it reprints out the new value. So there's that. All right, and the last thing I want to say is that you probably should not be using setOnMouseClicked for buttons, because you can select buttons other ways. For example, here, if I click a button, yes, that's selecting it, but if I press the space bar or enter, then it also selects a button. If I press tab, see how my computer cycles through the different form elements? If I press space bar, it counts as a click. So you don't really need to try to handle if you click the mouse or if you press enter on the mouse or space bar. Instead, you can attach a listener to setOnAction, and that traps both keyboard presses and mouse clicks. So the code change will be here. So for our OK button, instead of saying, did I actually click the button, we're going to do back to setOn, but instead setOnAction, because the action of a button being pressed could be done through keyboard or mouse. All right, so let's look in here. We have to pass in a custom event handler that handles action events instead of mouse listeners. So it's going to be the same thing as Bob. I think I'll just change Bob from a button handler to an action handler. I'm just going to rename it everywhere. And here was Bob, our button handler. And now I'm going to say it's going to be, it's still an event handler, but it handles action events this time. And same thing here. Instead of doing mouse events, it's going to be action event. But everything else, I believe, is the same. All right, let's import JavaFX action event, and we're good. So same as before, but instead of mouse events, it's just action event, but the code is all the same as it was before. Let me go ahead and take this out. So now here's why I chose action event instead of like literally did you click on the button. So we'll set action to Bob. Same thing for the cancel button. Instead of saying did I literally click the cancel button, I'm going to do setOnAction and pass in Bob as the same listener. And now this will be better because I can still click on the buttons, still works, but now I can like scroll off my keyboard. I can press space to select with my keyboard control, right? And this works the same in any program. Like in Eclipse, if I go to the project menu, I can start using the keyboard to go down, then press enter to select an item. I don't have to go down there and click with the mouse. So I would say use setAction for any kind of these events here. So any kind of one-time clicky things, buttons of any kind, even menu items like you just saw right here. If I go to slide and press the down arrow, I can still press enter and do this command without clicking on it. So setAction is for that design. All right, that's it. If you want to see more, then go ahead and click on Mr. McLeod's videos. He has more detail on these things and you can get the answer there, but this was just a one-shot deal. All right, take care. Bye.